welcome to our next session. Christina Timoney from one of our supporting sponsors, SeekOut, will be leading us through the session along with Harry Cohen from Salesforce. This session is going to be very appealing for our conference participants as we go on a journey of exploring how to move from really great intentions to actual practice. So Christina, let me have you take the stage and take us on that journey with this next session.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Timoney. I'm a senior DEIB strategy and enablement manager at SeekOut. And I'm joining you all from actually sunny Seattle. The sun's actually out today. So we'd love for all of you to pop into the chat and let us know where you are joining us from. I'm sure you're familiar with the drill, but this is intended to be an interactive session. So we are going to walk through a number of questions. And as mentioned, we'll have Harry to share some words of wisdom in terms of how to move from intentions to actually putting your goals into practice. But during the session, if you have questions, please do pop them into the chat. We would love to be able to get to them. So we'll kick off with just some quick introductions before we get started. So again, my name is Christina. As mentioned, I'm joining from SeekOut. And at SeekOut, I am very excited to have the privilege to build and lead our internal DEIB strategy. And I am joining most recently from working in the diversity of recruiting program space. And so most recently I worked at Stripe. I also had the opportunity to work at Slalom as well as Tableau. And I'm sure most of you know that Tableau is now a Salesforce organization. And that is where I had the opportunity to meet and work with Harry. Harry was one of the first people that I connected with on the Salesforce side. And actually was really instrumental in helping me build out our diversity sourcing strategy, which included utilizing SeekOut as part of that strategy. So I'm so excited to have him here today and to be able to share with all of you. Harry, if you want to introduce yourself, would love to hear just more about your role at Salesforce and also what makes you passionate about DEIB and what got you into this space.
Thanks, Christina. And super excited to be here, everyone. My name is Harry Colon, as mentioned, and I am coming at you live from sunny Miami, Florida. So I have been at Salesforce for the past 5 years. And I started as an individual contributor in recruiting and sourcing. And, you know, even before Salesforce, you know, I kind of fell into recruiting. It was kind of the best accident that ever happened in my life because I fell in love with the practice and the career. And so I think before DEIB and equality and diversity was kind of a big deal and a lot of companies began to speak about it. I kind of was already, you know, infusing that in my strategy as a recruiter and a sourcer. Reason being is, you know, I identify as Latinx, you know, and I remember my first big job at a tech company. I was super excited and I remember loving it and just the culture and the opportunity, compensation, benefits, work-life balance. And I told myself, you know, I don't know many other people in my community that work, you know, in tech. And oftentimes when I would speak to people from my community, they thought of tech as a software engineering company. And, you know, they didn't really stop to think about recruiting and human resources and program management. And I just got really excited about spreading the word. And so I kind of started to become that person that people would go to, right? Because every time I had a goal, a recruiting goal, I kind of would always have a high percentage of underrepresented minorities, women, folks with disabilities. And I just made it a mission of mine. And at Salesforce, you know, I was tapped to kind of start leading a team in this world. And for the past 2 years, I've been, you know, leading, you know, some of our strategy and equality at Salesforce, ensuring that we are building pipeline that's diverse. We're hitting our aggressive goals around representation. And I'm just in love with what I do because recruiters are kind of doorkeepers and we're the ones that are kind of in charge of bringing in talent. So a lot of the onus falls on us. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you for sharing. And it's funny, our stories are very similar. And I think for most folks who are working in the DEI space, we kind of have that same pathway of falling into it because it was a passion area for us. So, but again, we're just so excited to have you here today. So let's get right into it and let's get into the topic at hand. So as mentioned, we're here to talk about what is needed to move away from just intentions to actually put things into practice and make progress on goals. So as you also mentioned, in the last 5 or 10 years, there's certainly been an increase in calls to address diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace. I think it's safe to say those calls were amplified after the killing of George Floyd back in 2020. And since then, a lot of companies have come out with really bold statements and goals around their efforts to increase diversity and inclusion within their teams. But unfortunately, some teams, they're seeming to be falling short, right? And I know Salesforce, similar to SeekOut, we are very lucky and fortunate to have been able to be some of the few that have made progress. So again, just really excited to hear your insights and to be able to share some words of wisdom. So what do you think is the struggle? Why has it been difficult for companies to make progress on their goals?
Yeah, I think one thing that I always call out when speaking about strategy is that all underrepresented groups are not the same. They face different barriers, and we have to be intentional about our strategy for each of those groups. Intentionality is a word that I use a ton when I speak about this work. And so, the struggles or barriers that, the Latinx community or Black community face is going to be different from that of women, from folks with disabilities, from veterans. And so we need to speak about these strategies differently. And we need to also talk about, numbers differently. I think when we talk about equality, oftentimes companies will share a blanket goal. And, it's important for us to kind of break those out and speak about, this is where we are for each of the groups that we are targeting so that we understand from the bottom up, like, where are we falling short? Where do we need to be more intentional? Another thing is too, it's okay to create strategies for these different barriers, but once you employ folks, you have to remember that you have to treat them as people. And, as a Latinx person, I can't speak for all Latinos, we're not a monolithic people. And so it's important to understand that as well. Another thing is not just on recruiting, retention is a big piece of it too. And so again, with that feeling of belonging, and I love that we are now adding that word into this strategy, we have to work hand in hand. And the strategy should be from the very, very beginning to the end. How you're putting together, interview questions, how you're interviewing, how you're thinking about the total addressable market, how you're showing up. Once you employ these people, how are you assigning projects to people on your team? Who are you promoting? Why are you promoting them? It's really like it should be infused in every single part of the employee cycle. And also your strategy for recruiting.
Yeah. And I think you touched on something too that often gets asked is, the question of like, when do we start these efforts? Like, when do we begin? And I think, there's much, and it's a good thing that this is happening, but there's a lot more conversation around building structured interviews and having a structured interviewing process. Can you share a little bit more about what that looks like and the importance of that?
Yeah, super, super, super important. I think a misnomer, if you will, when we talk about equality, it's almost like seen by many as we're kind of doing some kind of service for folks. And, I disagree with that wholeheartedly. It's not about that giving handouts or lowering the bar. It's about creating an inclusive process so that more people are let in. And we have to think differently about, how are we describing the perfect candidate, right? And so oftentimes we look at the same schools, at the same companies. If we see a gap, we automatically assume that, well, there's a gap of 2 years. This person, for some reason, it's now a no good to hire. And so we have to start thinking about those things. So when we are going out and assessing our candidates, we're treating them all the same. And I'll give you some examples. I think, when recruiters are doing this work, something that happens, and I'll kind of pose a question: how many times for folks that have done recruiting in the past, Have you looked at a candidate and you said, oh my gosh, Oracle, IBM, Harvard, I cannot wait to speak to this candidate. You get on the phone with the candidate and they just blow it, right? And in the same vein, how many times have you, it's been 5 minutes before a call and you look at the profile and you're like, oh, why did I reach out to this person? They're clearly not a fit. You get on the phone with the person and they blow it out of the water and you're like, oh my gosh. I think it's important that you come into it with an open mind from the very beginning and you interview people all in the same way, right? You ask them the same questions. Just because this person didn't go to Harvard or comes from a smaller, well, less known company, I'm not going to make my interview harder or ask more questions. Kind of trying to see like almost if they're worthy of the interview. And so I think that's something that people call out all the time. So at Salesforce, we've built out a streamlined process where we're focusing on competencies. You know, before you even put out a job description, you have to sit down with your team and really understand what competencies make a good candidate for this particular role, right? And so that way, when recruiters and hiring managers are out in the market looking for folks, they're basing it on the same competencies, and it's inclusive of anyone that interviews.
Right. And evaluating everyone to those same standards and holding each other accountable to those standards that you set out from the beginning, which this rolls really nicely into the next question, which is really starting to dig a little bit more into those programs and processes. So tell us more, you know, what muscles do we need to build and what processes and programs do we need to have to create more equity in the hiring process? And as you touched on, and something that, you know, I think deserves more attention is how do you think about retaining that talent once you've hired them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's the first thing I will say is it isn't a one size fits all. You really have to understand as a company, you know, where are you falling short, right? And then start understanding what tools can help you get to where you need to be. I think here at Salesforce, SeekOut is a tool that we use a ton for many, many reasons. I think, first of all, it does a lot of the legwork for us in helping us reach to those folks that have already self-identified as underrepresented minority or women. And so we're not having to play that guessing game. And second thing is the total addressable market data that it provides. So tools for us are everything. I think we use SeekOut at Salesforce to really go into a meeting before the manager's telling me, Harry, this is what I'm looking for. I'm showing him what the market looks like. And I'm reminding him that, you know, I can't just poof candidates out of thin air, right? So we need to discuss right away so they understand what I'm working with. And another piece that, and we've touched on it a little bit, is the retention piece. You can hire and recruit till, you know, you drop dead. But if your company is not treating the employees fairly, if it's not providing opportunities, if it's not, you know, just treating every employee the same, you're going to keep losing talent, and retention is going to just be a problem. You're kind of working against yourself almost.
Right. And I will say, you know, the team, and one of, you know, our mentors at Salesforce is doing some really incredible work around the retention piece. And one of the things I think is so important for teams to do is to look at what the data shows. So for example, most companies do an engagement survey. If you take a look to see like which demographics are least engaged or having the least equitable experience, that's always a great place to start, right? And then use that data to then create programs and address, you know, some of the challenges that are happening. So maybe if you can share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so many good things, so many goodies. And, you know, you mentioned one of the programs that Salesforce is leveraging from a retention perspective. And we have something at Salesforce that we call the Warm Line. And the Warm Line was created for underrepresented minorities and women to have a safe space to come to HR and actually speak to folks that are, you know, they have a foundation in this work and understand, you know, the importance. And so they're already educated in this world. So, you know, they're kind of great resources for these people. And what they can do is they can bring anything really. If they're feeling like they're not being developed, if they're feeling overlooked, if they're feeling like something, it's unfair and anything, or they're facing microaggressions, they can come to these people and speak in a safe way. I think there's a lot of fear over retaliation, and sometimes people stay quiet. People are afraid to bring up anything, and these people really help them put a plan together. And the first thing that I always tell people when kind of talking about the warm line, it's not about calling people out. We have to, be okay as leaders with being called out sometimes and being vulnerable. It's a learning opportunity, honestly. And many instances, what we do is we provide a plan. Okay, so you feel like you should be promoted. Well, what have you done? Talk to me about some of the projects that you're on. Are you hitting your numbers, your metrics? All right, so let's do this. And they create a plan. They connect them to mentors, and I think that's important. They connect them to sponsors as well, so that people are really feeling empowered, enabled, and create a really good plan for moving forward. And if there's something in there that needs to be discussed, then we can also do that as well.
Right, which is so important because sometimes when you start to dig into data, and I will talk about data all day because I think it's such an important aspect to make sure that you're building the right strategies. But sometimes when you dig into the data, there are some teams that are doing a great job on the hiring front, but where they're missing out is the retention piece, right? And so it's creating like what's known as that leaky bucket. So being able to really intentionally dive into the work of like retention and development and promotion and addressing, the concerns or the challenges. And the best thing about doing this type of work is a lot of times, you start out in serving underrepresented groups, but it ends up benefiting everyone because, again, everyone needs to be developed. And we do need to have more intention around how do we, grow and promote our people. And so I always think that's an added benefit that comes from that. These programs, they ultimately create a better working environment and culture throughout the company. So as we're getting close to time, I want to transition to the last question for you, which again, I think is also extremely important. But what role do you think senior leadership plays in moving the needle? Because a lot of times, again, with these big goals, sometimes there can be a disconnect between, the execution of the individual teams and the priorities and focus of the senior leadership. So tell us a little bit more about the role that you think they play in moving this along.
I mean, it's beyond important. If senior leadership isn't bought into this work, it isn't going to work. They create the culture, they create the standard, they fund, they provide resources. So I'm very lucky that at Salesforce, at the very top, this is something that our CEO has said is important to him, and he walks the walk when it comes to resourcing, right? Because a lot of this work requires tools, requires partnership, requires thinking outside of the box, and that requires money. And so really just setting the standard and providing us with the resources that we need, listening to us, creating that culture of inclusiveness that keeps our people here once we hire them. And even just the way they show up in meetings and how they create that safe space for people to vocalize how they're feeling. So, I mean, it's a huge, huge deal.
Yeah. And I, plus one to that. And, I would say that's one of the things that drew me to the company now is, even just the humility of the senior leadership, right? And like the willingness to listen and to learn. And, again, to your point, to fund this work, right? Because it is a full job, right? And so, sometimes with DEI can sometimes become a side project, right? But in order to truly move the needle, like you do have to fund positions and you have to, create the right tools, but also, make it a priority. And, having senior leaders that can champion that can really make the difference. So thank you for sharing those insights. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think one more thing I will add is also, I see a lot of companies relying on their ERGs or on the communities they are targeting. And these are full-time jobs. And you have to make sure that if you're relying on employees of color or women to do a lot of this work for you, you have to pay them. And you have to realize that this takes a lot of work. And you shouldn't be putting the pressure on the community that's already feeling marginalized. So I think that's a huge thing to always call out, because oftentimes I see people doing two jobs at companies, doing their day job and then also creating strategy, educating, and oftentimes not getting the credit or the compensation that they deserve.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think, as senior leaders, for those that are in those capacities and have, the ear of folks at the leadership team, being able to advocate for those people and to help make sure that they're also being protected, because to your point, that takes time away from their job, that other groups don't have to deal with that experience. So the more that we can create the space and again prioritize the work appropriately, the better it will be. So yes, thank you again. I so appreciate you sharing your thoughts, and just again helping to showcase what helps us take us from intentions to actually driving the work forward.
Thank you for having me. I'm so love talking about this work, and just love to see that more and more companies are engaging in this very important work.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, well, thank you both, Christina and Harry. What a great conversation. And I've been monitoring the questions below, so we're going to switch over. And Harry, just some context. We find that our audience, they're really looking for such practical, hands-on experience. And so we have quite a number of questions about your Warmline team and the processes that are in place. Some of the questions around that are, is there training for Warmline that HR goes through? Does HR have to report on the discrimination that goes through? How long has it been in place? I think, our audience is looking to do a deep dive there.
Yeah, so I am not a part of that team. I do know a couple things about the work that they do, but I will say they've been around for about 2 years now, and they absolutely go through training, and they are a direct branch of the HR team. So yeah, I mean, they're not separate from HR. So if something goes on, any kind of discrimination, they're already a part of that family in HR. So they're already equipped. These are all HR folks that have the knowledge of HR, who also have this additional DEIB training going along with their day job. And I also saw a question around the impact that they're making. I mean, we've seen a huge impact. Many employees, I mean, I don't have any data to share, but we've seen retention just really improve, especially for women who use the Warmline. And we've also have a lot of examples of leaders who are very appreciative of being involved in some way, shape, or form, right? Learning about microaggression, learning about, how they show up as leaders. So again, the Warmline is not in place to get anyone in trouble. I always like to remind people of that. It's not about it's actually the last thing we want to do. It's actually, we want to create a system that holds people accountable and really educates folks. And we've gotten really good at becoming vulnerable at Salesforce because of it. I mean, I will admit, I was taken to the Warmline, and it wasn't a bad thing. It was, a learning situation for me. And I, work with the HR representative to really help one of my employees. So yeah, I love being a part of it, because something that I always tell people about this work, none of us have all the answers. You don't know what you don't know, and you have to be okay with being wrong and making mistakes.
So true. Yeah. And I just want to add to that too. I think what's important, kind of going back to like the training aspect, right? I think one of the things that's important to really underscore with why Salesforce and other companies have taken to creating programs like that, it's because there is a lack of, there's a sense of distrust, right, in the traditional HR lines of communication. And so we have to be mindful of that when you're thinking about creating those programs, right? And so either making sure that your HR teams are equipped and they're being trained, and they're also getting, enablement from like a DEI lens, or you're also hiring folks that can bring in that perspective, and making sure that your HR team is diverse is just also extremely important. We're really lucky here at SeekOut. We're a smaller company, just over 200 people, and we're building up our HR programs and processes. So we have we have the luck of being able to infuse this into how we work from the very beginning. But if you're thinking about doing this and infusing this like after the fact, if you have these teams already in place, it's really important to really start with, again, just thinking about why there is that need and how you can enable your HR team and function. And again, make sure there's diversity within your HR team to serve the needs of your people.
Yeah. Thanks for that build, Christina, as we dive into these conversations. You know, one of the other questions we have is really around how do employee referrals play a part in DEI from a recruiting standpoint?
Oh, huge. I think the first thing that we needed to do, I mean, every company needs to do is they need to be honest about how much their hires are coming from their referral program, and then creating a strategy that keeps that top of mind. For us at Salesforce, we created a conference called Representation Matters. And that conference is awesome because you get to talk to a ton of leaders that are in the space, but it also creates an additional layer of referrals for us, right, that are, from underrepresented minorities to kind of balance out our normal program. And we also have goals around hiring outside of just referrals so that we're not just depending on referrals. We have certain pockets where referrals are higher than others, like in our customer success group. A lot of where we get our hiring is from our referrals. We work with ERGs. So you just have to create a strategy that keeps the fact that referrals are just the big way that we hire. And that's okay. I'm not saying it's bad. It's definitely leverage it, but just keep that in mind when you're creating a strategy.
I feel the same. I think, I think sometimes the typical response is like, we want to stop referrals. And it's like, no, we don't want to stop referrals. But what we want to do is create, again, more intentionality about what a referral pool looks like. And so sometimes that means just calling on your leaders and your teams to diversify their referrals, like have them connect and build more connections with underrepresented communities so that we're shaping the demographic of our referral pool. So you can do both. Yeah. That's my thoughts.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And that's the one of the takeaways, which is it's not either or, it can be an and.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of the other questions we have here that I thought was great is one of our audience members is saying, I found that biases come into play when competencies are vague. Do you have any best practices about, how do you overcome that challenge?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, by the way. I saw it in the chat and I was like, I really want to touch on that. Absolutely. There's bias in everything, and it doesn't make you a bad person. It really doesn't. We all have them. We are all different. So when creating these job descriptions and talking about, these so-called competencies, you have to work hand in hand with your hiring manager. There have been instances where I've worked with a hiring manager and I wasn't too familiar with the job, right? I was new to this job. I brought in experts for the job, right? And that's something that we've normalized at Salesforce. Let's talk about what truly makes a competent candidate. And we've started over. We've gotten it wrong, but you can't be afraid. And sometimes you think you created the perfect job description, you've narrowed down the competencies, and when you start to see the pipeline, you start to realize, there's a lot of room for bias in here. And just based on who's getting hired, it's okay, go back to the drawing board, bring it up to your hiring manager, talk about what you're seeing. You have to normalize that conversation.
Yeah. I think another thing to that too is being willing to ask the questions, right? And poke holes where there is areas of subjectivity. Because I think, sometimes as recruiting partners, like we want to show up as if we have all the answers and we know all the things. But to Harry's point, sometimes it's okay to admit that, this is pretty vague. So let's really drill into it. What do you mean? What do I mean? Are we all talking the same language? Because sometimes we can come to this conversation with our own experiences that shape how we see things. So it's really, really clear to kind of get down to the nitty gritty to make sure that we're all speaking the same language.
Yeah, I love that. And, as we come to a close here, Thank you both. Thank you both for taking us in this conversation to a very practical level. Harry, I loved when you talked about, going from strategy to intentionality to speaking and then actioning, right? And that journey where you can think big and yet how do we land this? And so thank you for humanizing and bringing those stories to life. We certainly appreciate that.